Well, hello everybody, and thank you for watching this video. This is a recorded Zoom interview with a very, very special guest. Many of you know him, Don Swanson, longtime U.S. Geological Survey field geologist, volcanologist, stratigrapher, mapper, and so on and so on and so on. And Don is with us from his patio in Hilo, Hawaii. Don, what's the weather report this morning from Hawaii?
Weather report for now, the next hour is sunny and nice, but you can't predict beyond that.
Well, we'll take it. We'll take it for the next hour.
I'll
Thank you
take it.
so
Yeah.
much. Thank you so much for being with us here, Don. Viewers, we could go on and on about Don's career. I think you started, didn't you, with the USGS in the mid 60s? Does that sound right, Don?
Yeah, I joined in late 65. That's
Wow.
right.
Okay. So, I mean, come on, we're coming up on 60 years of a career. So, we could talk about St. Helens and all the drama there with David Johnston and so on. We could talk about the flood basalts. We could talk about all your fine work in Hawaii. But, Don, I think, at least with this interview, I'd like to focus on the South Cascades in the state of Washington, south of Snoqualmie Pass, north of Columbia River Gorge. And your name is over everything with these maps, reports, field trip guides, and everything else. So, to get us started, would you mind giving us a feeling for the earliest time in your career? Who were your influences? Who were your mentors to get you started in geology?
Well, I went to graduate school at Johns Hopkins University, and my professor was Aaron Waters. And Aaron and his assistant professor, Cliff Hobson, and their graduate student, Dick Fisk, had just
Wow.
completed working at Mount Rainier. And they had developed the stratigraphy at Mount Rainier. That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's really a classic paper. And so I arrived just when the report was being written, and so Aaron was still deeply involved with Cascade stratigraphy, and so he suggested that I do a PhD thesis in the Tieton River area, the Tieton Basin, Rimrock Lake, and the canyon downstream from there. And he told me, well, he had just completed a paper about the Columbia River basalt. And so that was high on his mind too. And he thought that there was a dike swarm that fed the Columbia River basalt that I could see in the Tieton River Canyon. And so I went there expecting to see that. And lo and behold, that dike swarm turned out to be a radial dike swarm associated with a pre Columbia River basalt volcano that I named Tieton Volcano. And so here I
Yes.
was, a lowly graduate student, wondering how am I going to contradict her professor. But I developed a lot of evidence, and I did it, and Aaron accepted it completely. And so that was my introduction to the Cascades through the work of Fisk, Waters, and Hobson.
Okay, well, we're out of the gates fast. I mean, that is fascinating just right there. If you don't mind me going back and forth you through a little bit, so why do you think he thought those were some dike swarms related to the Columbia River basalts? Had he done some recon in that area, do you think?
Well, Nick, it beats me. It's pretty evident that the dikes are not CRB. A lot of them
Uh,
are porphyritic with plagioclase and even a pyroxene. And I can excuse him for not having mapped their orientation, but I don't understand why he thought they were
uh,
had their proper petrography, but he did, and so that was one of the lines of evidence that I used to convince him that they were not CRB.
so what was it like studying at Johns Hopkins? That must have been a real exciting time. I know a little bit about Aaron Waters, but I'm not really sure exactly. So didn't he grow up in Washington as well as you?
Believe it or not, he was born in Waterville, but there's no relationship, I don't think.
Okay.
And yeah, and so yeah, he did a lot of work in Washington, and the stories you've heard about Aaron Waters, probably some of them were negative because he had a very strong personality and tend to be quite biting in his criticisms. But I want to tell you one story that really puts it in a different light. Uh, for when I was preparing for my second field season, this would have been in the spring of 1963. He called me into his office and said, "Don, are you going to try to drive that old car of yours across to Washington again?" And I said, "Yeah, that's all I have." And so he pulled out a checkbook and he wrote me a check for $200. These are 1963 dollars. And he said, "Don, if you have any problems along the way, use this check." Now that is
Wow.
something. Yeah.
You
So
got
that's
a
why
lot.
I have a soft spot in my heart for Aaron Waters. And incidentally, his one of his relatives, or I think the relative of his wife, lived in Edenville, Washington, and that's
Okay.
one of my two hometowns. So there are a lot of ways in which we intertwine.
Nice. Did you have, so you say you were showing up at Johns Hopkins right on the heels of this major 1963 publication with Aaron Waters and Dick Fisk and who was the third? Uh,
uh,
yeah, Cliff Hobson.
Cliff
Yes.
Hobson.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
why do you think that publication came to be when it did with the Rainier area?
Well, there was, I don't know what the background of that is necessarily, but the Park Service wanted a geologic study made, and they turned to the USGS to do it. So the work was done in the mid and especially late 60s, late 50s.
Right.
I came to Hopkins in the fall of 1960, but and the paper was then being written. But
Hmm.
yeah, there was some interagency agreement between the Park Service and the USGS that got it going. Aaron was then a consultant with the USGS, and so he was asked by the USGS to do it, and Cliff and Dick Fisk got involved. And incidentally, I should mention another person, Tom Wright. Tom is not an author of that paper, but Tom did his PhD thesis on the Tatoosh Pluton
Mm.
in near the national park, and has published several papers.
Mm.
And remarkably, Dick Fisk and Tom Wright are colleagues of mine, and we still cooperate on research, even though, well, Dick is almost 90 and I'm 86 and Tom is
Yeah.
89.
Yeah. Well, was there a bullpen of other graduate students at Hopkins that were also doing work out here in the Pacific Northwest, or was it just you?
One person, Hans Ulrich Schmicke from Germany, was involved, and he and I arrived at the same time at Hopkins, and he did his work mainly on the Ellensburg Formation and on the lava flow that intertongues with the Ellensburg in many places and burrowed into it, the Pomona flow.
Yeah.
So Hans was really the one who defined the Pomona flow, and he and I worked in the same at the same time, and we would meet each other every 2 or 3 weeks to kind of have a break. And he stored his car in the barn that belonged to the brother of Aaron Waters. And so there's a nice story there. When the spring of '63, when Hans and I arrived at Richard Waters' barn, we were having dinner with them, and Richard was very quiet, and he finally said, "You know, my brother tells me that these big rocks out here were brought down by a glacier, and you know, my brother's a pretty smart guy, but you know, he doesn't know a goddamn thing." This was Aaron Waters, who was just on the verge of being inducted into the National Academy of Sciences.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
Wonderful stuff. Wonderful stuff.
yeah.
Before we flash forward, maybe to I know you did a lot of field work in the Cascades in the 80s and the 90s and probably other times as well. It, who comes to mind for Cascade work, field work before the 60s, before the late 50s when Fisk and others were doing their work? Like I go all the way back to Israel Russell and Bailey Willis and those guys, but is there a huge chasm between the turn of the century and the 50s?
George Otis Smith did a lot
Hmm.
of work, and then Walter Warren, I think his first name was Walter, I'm not sure, worked in the Tieton River area and
Huh.
kind of corrected some of the stratigraphy that Smith had done from horseback.
Yeah.
But really, there wasn't a lot of work that had been done.
Right.
And then following the Mount Rainier report, then Paul Hammond got involved in the later 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
And it was some of his reconnaissance work that kind of got me interested in doing more detailed mapping in the Cascades. And I was, during the 1980s, I was involved with the Mount St. Helens field work. But as the eruption waned and I got kind of tired of that, then I started thinking more about looking at the Cascades and particularly the tertiary Cascades. My wife and I had a book that was titled something like Lookouts in the State of Washington. And so on weekends, we would try to visit as many lookout sites as we could. And by definition, of course, you have good visibility from those lookouts. And then I realized that, there's a lot of work that can be done in this area geologically that Paul Hammond hasn't done. So I think in about 1987 or 88, I started spending quite a bit of time mapping in the area and between St. Helens and Goat Rocks, and that continued until I moved to Hawaii and at the end of 1996. So.
Well, let's dig into that because you might be aware that I'm part of two new projects, one with the Goat Rocks and another with the Spirit Lake Pluton. And
Mhm.
I'm starting to try to teach myself a bunch of new things involving those tertiary units. And I've got a long way to go, but your name keeps coming up in all these maps and documents and field guides. Do you remember when you did start in the mid 80s to kind of look from that lookout, those vantage points? First of all, there's not that many outcrops, are there, in Western Washington? How are you actually coming up with a plan to map?
Well, since I grew up basically in the area,
Yeah.
I knew that every time there was a little creek, was going to be an outcrop along the creek. And so what I did was to test this hypothesis by walking up a couple of the creeks, and indeed that was true. So the way that I did the mapping and got around the problem of not having obvious outcrops was that I would walk up one small creek from the bottom of a ridge to the top in the morning and then come down in the afternoon on a creek alongside. And so just up, down, up, down, up, down, day after day after day. And it may seem boring, and in fact, it was kind of boring for the some of the field assistants that I had from time to time. But by doing this, I was able to piece together the stratigraphy from one creek to a neighboring creek to the next creek over, the next creek over. And so in doing so, I was able to get around the lack of obvious exposures that you that you look for but can't see by driving
Right,
cars.
right,
So in reality, the area is not particularly poorly exposed, really, but you just
right.
have to work for it. Yeah.
Boy, you must have been in great shape during those field seasons for sure. And
Yeah.
I'm just getting started, but what are some units that you broke out? Like what were you working with some recon, very broad scale stuff, and you were down to the 7.5 minute scale and really breaking out unit after unit?
I was trying to break out as many units as I could, but not giving them names. I was looking at the lithology. and not trying to name them. You see, I started my long-term goal was to see how the stratigraphy and the tertiary rocks compared with the Fisk Hobson Waters Mount Rainier stratigraphy.
Oh,
Ohanabakash, Stevens Ridge, Fife's Peak. And but I didn't want to use those names starting so far away. And people had done that, and it kind of went against my training. I wanted to discover evidence to support those correlations rather than just using the names to start with. So I worked out a lot of local units and just went from quadrangle to quadrangle, 8 or 9 quadrangles I mapped between there and Goat Rocks. And my long range plan, which was intercepted by my move to Hawaii, was to then kind of piece all this together into some stratigraphic paper that would confirm and deny some of the correlations to Ohanabakash, Stevens Ridge, Fife's Peak that had been suggested, but I never got around to quite doing that. But I think the table is set now for people who want to try.
interesting. So I'm just curious, what was your working nomenclature if you didn't want to use those names? Did you have a numbering system, or how did you, a colored pencil scheme, or how did you keep track of those units?
No, I just used lithologies.
Yeah.
So fine-grained diaphaseous rocks, diamix, stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this was in the tertiary part of the section. Now, of course, when you go higher in the section, then you get into obviously definable units, particularly the mid Miocene 12, 13 million year old rocks around Kidd Creek and Blue Lake volcano.
Okay.
And then up into Blue Lake is younger, and then up into eventually Quaternary. But for the older tertiary rocks, I just use lithologies without giving them names.
Sure. Well, it feels like maybe after a decade plus of that detailed work, season after season after season, from my point of view, it feels like you're having two major field trips. Maybe there were many more, but this International Geological Congress in 1989, there's like frickin' 65 different stops over the course of 6 days or something. I think I'm going to try to follow some of those field stops and make a few videos.
Yeah.
And then the 1994 GSA meeting in Seattle, where you edit this whole 2-volume set, which we all use so often, and you're working, one of your field trips was with Russ, how do I pronounce it?
Russ Everts, yeah.
Everts. So were you partners in crime with Russ for a time and were mapping back and forth, or somehow doing separate things and then collating a field trip simply?
We were mapping at the same time, but Russ Everts and Roger Ashley were working in the St. Helens area per se, and in the blowdown area, and they were focused on the Spirit Lake Pluton and its wall rocks and things, whereas I was working just to the east of there, and so we didn't overlap much, but we visited each other 2 or 3 times, and then for that guide, we decided to collaborate and put everything together. Russ, incidentally, went on to work in the Columbia River Gorge later on and prepared wonderful maps there. He unfortunately died of cancer at a young age, but that's the way it goes. But anyway, yeah, we were good friends and collaborators.
So you were not involved in the Spirit Lake Pluton mapping or any of those units that may have been, that I think Mike Eddy is now going in there with some high precision geochronology and trying possibly to tie some of those volcanic units to the Spirit Lake Pluton. Were any of those volcanic units to the east, perhaps units that he might be tying to that Pluton?
I wouldn't be a bit surprised if they are, but I had no way of knowing that. So Mike's ages will be really useful in that regard.
Good.
And
Good.
incidentally, I wanted to mention that They're what's the age of the Spirit Lake Pluto now? I've kind of forgotten that.
I think roughly 20 or 21 million years ago.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, there's some rocks that are a little younger than that. Uh, Dacitic and some of them quartz bearing that forms a thick section of sills in the McCoy Peak and Tower Rock quadrangles, I think, Packwood Lake, and but they're around, I think, 13, 14 million years old. So, but anyway, there was a period, a broad period of time during which there were more silicic rocks being intruded into the Cascades,
Huh.
including the Spirit Lake Pluton and these other sills that really haven't been happening after that. It's kind of interesting. And of course, I guess I should back off and say that St. Helens, of course, has a lot of dacite associated with it, but
Yeah.
it's so I think there's a lot more work that can be done on the intermediate and silicic volcanism and intrusions within the late tertiary in the southern Washington Cascades.
Well, I think one of the main reasons that Mike Eddy chose the Spirit Lake Pluton is the detailed mapping and those units being broken out so beautifully for him to come in and not do a bunch of mapping, but actually come in and sample appropriately and have some strategies. So that's Russ and Roger and you, it sounds like, that laid the groundwork for that. So
Yeah, well,
uh,
I sure hope that our mapping can help him in that regard. I should say that probably my mapping in the Frenchman Butte and Greenhorn Butte quadrangles is not quite as good as my later mapping because that's where I started out. And I was
okay.
learning tricks along the way and so forth. But I hope it helps. I hope it helps,
I'm
Mike. Anyway.
I'm sure it does. So, what are a few quads that you are particularly proud of? Are we working east towards the Goat Rocks now, also in that part of your career where you've got things figured out and exactly how you want to publish and how you want to approach this mapping?
Well, I think the quadrangles that I'm happiest with are named Hamilton Buttes, McCoy Peak, Tower Rock. Let's see, I've forgotten some of the other names, but anyway, those in the northeastern corner of the mapped area. And then I had prepared a geologic map of the Goat Rocks it, itself, the old Snowy Mountain quadrangle and so forth. And I was just about ready to open file that when I made the move to Hawaii, and then it slipped and I never did get around to it. But thank goodness Kelly Wall came along. Kelly approached me 10 years ago and told me that she was interested in the Goat Rocks. And so I sent her all the stuff that I had, all my field notes, the map and all that stuff. And now she's doing the work that will be a cut or several cuts above what I could have done if I'd published the map in the late 1990s. And I'm really happy to be able to help her and her colleagues in the Goat Rocks. Goat Rocks is a marvelous area. I had actually worked there a bit in the summers of 81 and 82
Okay.
because the Forest Service wanted a mineral appraisal of all wilderness areas. And so the USGS asked me to do the Goat Rocks wilderness area. And I said, yeah, I jumped at the chance. But interestingly, we were allowed to use helicopters in the wilderness, which of course you can't do, but the Forest Service gave us special dispensation. So Jeff Clayton, a graduate student at UW, and I kind of sort of started our Goat Rocks work there. So then when I returned to the area in the late mid 1990s, I had a leg up. I had a start on the area that made things work out pretty well. But as I said, Kelly is with all the ages that she's getting in the chemistry and more detailed stratigraphy is taking it beyond what I had ever been able to do.
It's an exciting new project with Kelly and Hannah Shamloo here at Central Washington University. But yeah, we all know how that works. They're building upon what you were doing. I'm curious, had anybody done any work in the Goat Rocks before you started that work in the early 80s?
Yeah, there was an old thesis that was done that I don't remember when it was now, but
Right.
ancient. I've forgotten the name of the guy.
Huh.
From Washington State, I think. But that was in the days even before uh, flux gate magnetometers that I used a lot to determine polarities in the field, and
Yeah.
before chemistry was readily available.
Mhm.
So his work, although it helped in places, was pretty much supplanted by the work that Kelly and I have done.
Nice. Well, as a teacher, I'm looking for new narratives as I try to work with all these tertiary units in the Cascades. And, I'm just going up with my little camera and making field videos on nice days that there's high pressure over the Cascades. And my first major moment, I guess, is realizing how vast and how thick and how important that Ohanapakash formation is. I didn't quite realize how extensive that is.
Yeah.
Can you think of some other major units that I should definitely make sure to visit? I guess we're going younger in the history of the Cascade Volcanic Arc, but are they all like the Ohanapakash, or is the Ohanapakash somehow special in what appears to be a major story in the early days of the Cascades?
Well, the Johannesburg is different than the other units. The Stevens Ridge, a series of ash flows, is much more localized, and the Fifes Peak is confined to a single but large andesitic and basaltic andesitic centers. But the Johannesburg was sort of in a depot basin. Material was carried into it from surroundings, and probably a lot of the greenish volcanic clastic rocks that I was mapping as far south as French Butte, Greenhorn Butte, probably those I would now correlate with the Johannesburg. But it's I would do that with some trepidation, but I couldn't do that with Stevens Ridge and Fifes Peak. Now, incidentally, there's a very interesting relationship that a guy named Winters found working with Paul Hammond, and then I expanded that work. That shows that the lower part of this greenish volcanic clastic unit that maybe Johannesburg intertongues with micaceous arkose. So this is not the Johannesburg was not deposited on arkose. It intertongues with the arkose.
Huh.
And the heavy mineral assemblage of the arkose indicates a provenance that could be in the metamorphic rocks in northeastern Washington. So it looks as if the start of Johannesburg was in a basin into which rivers from the what is now the Columbia Plateau and northeastern Oregon were flowing into. So that's something that needs to be followed up in more detail. And I described this in one of the later quadrangles that I'm at, maybe the Packwood Lake quadrangle. I'm not sure, but anyway, it's the Arkose of Chambers Lake. I think this is a very, very important relationship. This interbedding of the Arkose and these early volcanic clastic rocks.
I mean, that's the kind of stuff I'm looking for, Don. Like, there's so much to learn. It's a little winter project I'm going to have to try to find just sink my claws into a few things that are interesting relationships. And it's nice to hear from folks who've been thinking about this stuff for a long time. Paul Hammond does keep coming up, and I have had the good fortune to be out in the field a little bit with Paul just to learn from him directly. How much did you guys work together?
We're in the field a fair bit, off and on, and usually it was he wanted to show me some things, and um, I often disagreed with his interpretations on a pleasant basis. I will have to say this about Paul: he is
Yeah.
one of the most gentlemanly geologists that I've ever met, and he was readily accept accepting other ideas and wouldn't try to force his ideas upon me. And I always really appreciated being with a gentleman, and Paul is that.
Well, it's interesting you say that. The few times I've been with him has been kind of him leading kind of open field trips for the public, like some cabin owners association up by Bumping Lake or something.
Yeah.
And I was not only learning all this detail from him, I was also fascinated how he would deal with all these oddball questions. And half the time he would just kind of go, "Yeah, sure, why not?" Somebody was
Yeah.
pushing something so hard, you get those questions and they
Yeah.
think they already have the answer. Say, "Oh yeah, why not? That
Yeah.
sounds like a good idea." I like that. I've used that since that time. Um, how about speaking of oddballs, how about a few oddball questions for you? And then this is plenty. This is just such a thrill to be able to talk to you in this forum. Um, what do you think of the idea that the Columbia River basalts extended over the crest of the Cascades, and there's been uplift of the Cascades since then? I've heard Eric Cheney talk about that over the years. I don't know if anybody else likes it, but I mean, we get to Divide Ridge south of Rimrock Lake, and then we kind of lose those CRBs. Who better to ask than you? Is there any reason to think that's a possibility?
I was sure looking for that when I was working south or west, southwest of Gold Rocks. I never found a single remnant.
Hmm,
That doesn't mean to say that they weren't there one time and had been eroded off.
yeah,
Um, and but I never, it's you build a case with no evidence for it.
right, right.
On Divide Ridge, the basalts were, many of them were uh, uh, flowing into water. There were rivers present, and but whether the rivers were, it was hard to tell for sure. But I thought the rivers were flowing eastward from the Cascades, so that the higher part of the Cascades was still farther west than that. But I can never be sure of that. And so
Yeah.
I was very open to the possibility and was looking very carefully for Grand Ronde west of the crest, but I never found any.
Okay. Um, I mean, we're back to Ohanapakash time. We're essentially at sea level or something like that, right? With a bunch of those deposits.
I think so. There, one of the things that I found from my mapping of these greenish volcaniclastic rocks is that there were a lot of deposits that looked to me to be fluvial, or at least something shallow water. There were no deep water deposits such as what Dick Fisk described at
Mm,
Mount Rainier. So I
mhm,
think either I was confined only to the eastern edge of some deeper basin, or the Ohanapakash was not in a deep basin per se
mm,
in the
mm.
south of say the Cowlitz River.
Well, I guess what I'm driving at is what's your take on when the major uplift in the Cascades took place? I mean, even 10 million years ago, do you think we're still pretty low? And it's not until younger than 5 million years ago that we have this dramatic rise and this profound rain shadow effect?
I think the excuse me.
Wow, this one's wow, this one got you going a little bit. All right.
Yeah. I think or at least the old interpretation used to be that the fossils in the Ellensburg suggested a dry climate. And so the idea was 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that the
Yeah.
Cascades already formed a high, watershed.
Hmm.
But exactly when the regional uplift occurred is not something that I can really address right here.
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
address, there are northwest trending folds cutting through the southern Washington Cascades. And the work that John Hagstrom and I did on the Kidd Creek intrusive suite, this is described in the McCoy Peak quadrangle.
Okay.
There's a radial-like swarm associated with a mineralized pluton at Camp Creek. Anyway, John Hagstrom drilled a lot of Kidd Creek intrusive suite rocks for paleomagnetic directions. And he finds that those directions and these rocks these intrusions are a straddle a couple of these northwest trending faults. And they failed the fold test,
Huh.
which means that they were intruded after folding had occurred.
Yeah.
So, and those dikes and sills are about 13 million years old, whereas there were rocks that he dated argon as young as about 19 million years that are clearly folded. So the folding was occurring by 19 million years, but had ended by about 13 million years.
Hmm.
So that we can tell for the northwest trending folds. But the broader regional uplift,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so far as I'm concerned, anybody's guess.
Sure. Um, this has been so fun. Thank you. I just want to add one personal note. Back in the mid 90s, I was starting to think about leading geology field trips to the Big Island, and Steve Lundblad and Steve was teaching here at Central as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we got the idea to bring people over, and we did. And you took the time to go out with us. And I know that you've spent so many hours in the field with groups of all sizes. But what really impressed me thinking about getting ready for my chat with you is that you were pretty early with the internet in 1997, where Steve and I are reading your blog posts every morning. It felt like you were driving to the end of Chain of Craters Road 7 days a week. Um, I know we're totally switching topics, but that left a huge impression on me, Don. Like I was in my mid 30s at the time, and now I'm over 60. And I'm like, man, when I get older, I would love to be able to find something that I would just want to do every day of the week, not even take a day off on Saturday or Sunday. It seems like that's what you were doing. Did you feel like why were you so committed to that blog posting on the internet from your work at the HVO?
Well, I was in charge of the observatory for 8 years, and I thought that I owed the public updates as to what was going on, and so I would get up before dawn, drive up from
Yeah,
Hilo,
right.
and walk out, and usually try to get out when lava flows were going into the ocean or approaching the ocean just about at sunrise, and then I reported back via the blog so that people could then eat their breakfast and read what I had seen that morning.
Exactly.
And I thought it was a good public relations ploy. And I've had a lot of people commend me for that. And I've really been gratified at how people did it. And then eventually things changed and I left the scientist in charge position and I turned it over to other people. But I really, yeah, it was something that I could do every day, essentially 7 days a week. And
It was. It was. It left a huge impression on me. So thank you for doing that. I know that there were many, many that were enjoying those posts, but that opened up possibilities, I think, for me mentally to what I could maybe do here as well using and if somebody's young and watching this, they're like, so what? Like he did some blogs. This is early mid 90s, like this really wasn't happening at that time. You kind of blazed a path for kind of getting stuff immediately. Like that was so crazy. We could see something from that morning. So I'm going too far with that, but I really enjoyed that so much. Is there anything, any final thoughts, Don, from the Cascades, your work, or anybody that you thought of that you wanted to mention here as major players in the research in the Cascades over the years?
Well, I did want to thank Daryl Cowan and Joe Vance and Eric Cheney from the University of Washington. I shifted my office from Vancouver, from the Cascades Volcano Observatory to UW in 1990 and was there through 1996. And
Hmm.
Daryl was chair and opened up an office for me. In fact, I was in Peter Mish's old office.
Oh, were you really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And I learned fishing track dating from Joe, and then Eric was always there to discuss things. And so um, I really appreciated that camaraderie that I had with those people. I was still with the USGS, but they were my closest companions during that time.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Please hold the line. I'm just going to stop the record and then we'll visit a little bit more before we say goodbye. But thank you so much for your time this morning, Don.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Okay.